So folks are still coming in, but let's begin. It is my pleasure again to welcome everybody to the Wiedenbaum Center for a topic that is close to the long-term interest of the center. I am very pleased to recall, as you know, that our center's founder and the namesake of the center, Murray Wiedenbaum, was a prominent researcher in cost-benefit analysis. The reputation of the center in its earlier days, the Center for the Study of American Business, is often that it was kind of anti-regulation, but that's somewhat misleading because Murray understood that government regulation could realize important social goals, but he insisted that the benefits of regulation had to be balanced against the cost imposed on individuals, imposed on businesses. So Murray was a real proponent of this idea that we need to think rationally about regulation. And that the objective is to structure regulations that are efficient in the sense that the benefits exceed the costs. And this topic has been central for years to the research of our speaker. Michael Livermore is the Edward F. Howry Professor of Law at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. He has very wide-ranging expertise. I was looking at his website. He's written on a wide variety of topics, but of particular relevance to today's conversation, Professor Livermore has co-authored 3 books on cost-benefit analysis. His work focuses on finding a middle ground in the debates about regulatory policy between the left and the right. And he said both need to kind of come together to focus on the cost-benefit framework. And the objective is, again, to promote rational and evidence-based decisions in government policymaking. So I'm really looking forward to hearing Michael's perspective on this important issue. And again, this issue that's so close to the Wiedenbaum Center. So welcome, Professor Livermore, and I will pass on the Zoom to you.
Wonderful. Well, thanks so much. It's really wonderful to have the chance to speak with you all today. And it is a real pleasure to have this event hosted by the Wiedenbaum Center and to have the chance to talk about cost-benefit analysis. When I first kind of started doing research on this topic, obviously Murray's work and his influence is just really profound. So it is particularly fun to talk about this most recent project with this group here. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and I'll go ahead and get started. So what I'm going to be talking about a little bit today is a recent book came out in December 2020. Titled Reviving Rationality, Saving Cost-Benefit Analysis for the Sake of the Environment and Our Health. And this is co-authored with a frequent collaborator of mine, Richard Revesz, who is at NYU. So just to kind of contextualize this project a little bit, this is a kind of a companion book to an earlier effort that Ricky and I published in 2008, which was titled Retaking Rationality, Proving Cost-Benefit Analysis for the Sake of the Environment and Our Health, a similar kind of idea. And what we do in Retaking Rationality is we kind of look at the history of the use of cost-benefit analysis to evaluate federal regulatory policy in the United States. And the time frame that we look at there starts roughly with the 1970s and takes us up through kind of the end of the George W. Bush administration. And so the beginning of the story really is with folks like Murray Wiedenbaum, who were interested in broadly, it's true that this group of scholars, kind of somewhat conservative in their orientation, certainly for the day. I'm not sure we consider them conservative today, but for the time, their views were conservative, pro-business. And there was a sense that the regulatory buildup that had happened kind of especially in the 1970s around environmental health and safety regulations was imposing a lot of costs on the economy, was maybe contributing to negative macroeconomic phenomena like inflation. And the business community in particular was interested in kind of promoting an agenda of dialing back the stringency of the regulatory state. And this message was picked up by scholars and then folks within both political parties to a certain extent, certainly within the Reagan wing of the Republican Party, but there were also folks in the Democratic Party who were fairly enthusiastic about this regulatory reform agenda, including Jimmy Carter for that matter. And cost-benefit analysis was one of the tools that was kind of put on the table at the time. There were actually others, but cost-benefit analysis was one of the methods that it was thought that could be used to kind of rationalize the regulatory state. And for its proponents, they generally thought that rationalizing the regulatory state was going to result in less regulation, because their view was that there was too much regulation. And so what ends up happening after Ronald Reagan is elected president is he institutes this incredibly important change in the regulatory state. He had been, he built on earlier efforts, but the Reagan architecture that's put in place is really profound. And what happens is there's an executive order that the President Reagan adopts shortly after he moves into the White House. In that executive order, he grants a recently created office, the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, which exists in the Office of Management and Budget, the power and the authority to review regulatory proposals that are issued by executive agencies across the government. So the idea is that the executive order requires agencies to submit their regulatory proposals to the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, which is in the White House. And before they're supposed to, move forward their regulations, they're supposed to seek OIRA's approval. And so that's kind of the institutional mechanism that the Reagan order puts in place. And then second, there was a substantive standard that OIRA was going to use in the course of its review, and the substantive standard was cost-benefit analysis. So agencies were to prepare detailed economic analyses of their rules, and then that was what essentially was going to be reviewed by OIRA. So we review a little bit of this history in Retaking Rationality, and it's in service of the point that what kind of ends up happening as a consequence of the political context where cost-benefit analysis kind of comes into its own in the US regulatory state is that there's a political valiance to the institution, in the sense that it's kind of embraced by conservatives, it's put in place by a Republican president, and progressive groups and folks in the Democratic Party were generally oppositional to the use of cost-benefit analysis and OIRA review. And that mapped onto an institutional conflict between the president and the Congress, because essentially, you had a Republican president, you had a largely Democratic Congress, and OIRA review is a mechanism for presidents to impose their authority over the administrative state. So Democrats in Congress didn't like that. And there was a debate over the substance of cost-benefit analysis, where many protection-oriented groups, so like labor unions or environmental organizations or consumer organizations, felt that the methodology of cost-benefit analysis was biased against regulation. The costs would be inflated, the benefits would be undercounted, and the result would be essentially an irrational anti-regulatory effect. And so this dynamic, where progressives oppose cost-benefit analysis and conservatives and industry support cost-benefit analysis, essentially stays in place for a couple of decades. And that's what we explore in this first book. Part of what is kind of an important argument that we make in that book is that opposition to cost-benefit analysis, at the time that we were writing in 2008, we argued that opposition to cost-benefit analysis was a strategic error on the part of progressives for a few different reasons. One is that cost-benefit analysis had become firmly entrenched in the administrative state by the 2008, by that period. One of the kind of most important dynamics that led to that entrenchment was that presidents of both political parties, and in particular Bill Clinton, endorsed the structure of OIRA review and cost-benefit analysis. So there was pressure on the early Clinton administration to just abandon what was seen as a mostly kind of Republican institution. But Bill Clinton recognized that these were tools that didn't necessarily have an inherently political or partisan orientation, that both cost-benefit analysis and certainly regulatory review could be used in either a progressive or a deregulatory way. And actually, shortly after she left the Clinton administration in 2001, Elena Kagan, now Justice, obviously, Elena Kagan, back when she was a professor at Harvard Law School, wrote a very famous piece called Presidential Administration, where she makes exactly this point, that these tools of oversight, like OIRA review, are not inherently biased towards one party or the other. They just improve the ability of presidents to impose their will, and that could push agencies towards more regulation, or it could rein in agencies. It just kind of depends on the political context. So, what we argue in Retaking Rationality is that progressives were making a strategic mistake, and rather than trying to end the practice of cost-benefit analysis and regulatory review, what they ought to do instead is to work to improve the methodology to make it more neutral and to remove potential biases that exist in the methodology, in part because of their failure to engage on these methodological questions. Because over the course of the Reagan, Bush, and even during the Clinton administration, and then again during the Bush II administration, the progressives had largely absented themselves from debates about how to carry on the methodology. They just kind of took this oppositional posture. And we argue that that was a mistake, and we encourage them to engage in debates over cost-benefit analysis methodology, rather than taking this broadly oppositional posture that they had. So that takes us to 2008 and the publication of Retaking Rationality. The period that we cover in Reviving Rationality, our most recent book, is from the beginning, essentially, of the Obama administration through the first term of the Trump administration. And we kind of revised some of our earlier ideas in light of experience, and we cover this kind of second historical period. So one of the arguments that we use to kind of structure the narrative of Reviving Rationality is that prior to the Trump administration, in any case, cost-benefit analysis could be seen and understood as part of a broad system of guardrails that had been built up in the administrative state, that had been endorsed by leaders of both political parties, that operated to channel and cabin political influence over administrative agencies. And these guardrails were a way of balancing kind of two generally competing tendencies in the administrative state, two of the kind of pillars of the legitimacy of the administrative state. So one legitimating set of characteristics of agencies is their expertise, their impartiality, their technocratic characteristics. And that's an important part of why we feel okay about delegating a lot of authority to administrative agencies. There's also, though, the many ways that we enmesh agencies within accountability structures, including accountability to the president, accountability to Congress, judicial review. And those accountability structures create legitimate room for politics or political actors to influence agency decision-making. So, the question is, how do you balance these two tendencies? On the one hand, you want to protect space for expertise and analysis and evidence. On the other hand, you want to, give some play to political influence as a way of ensuring that agencies are responsive to democratic institutions and responsive to the American public. And so these guardrails, which include cost-benefit analysis, OIRA review, doctrines of judicial review of administrative agencies, are a way of kind of negotiating this tension by placing, kind of bounds around agency discretion and political influence. So, and we argue that this system had built up over many years, including, going back all the way to the New Deal and the, Administrative Procedure Act, but in particular, in the kind of post-Nixon, Reagan, Clinton order, where we see the kind of modern apparatus set up. So one of the interesting features of the time period after we published Retaking Rationality that we discuss in some detail in the book is what we call the threatening synthesis of the Obama administration. And the threatening synthesis was that, it became very clear early on that the Obama administration was going to pursue two things simultaneously. One was a fairly aggressive and progressive regulatory agenda on many fronts, including, and at pretty much any agency you can think of, certainly at EPA, but elsewhere as well, SEC, FCC, name your agency. And so that had become clear. On the other hand, it also became clear that the administration was going to be committed to the use of cost-benefit analysis. And that commitment became particularly clear when Obama put Cass Sunstein, installed Cass Sunstein as the first OIRA administrator in his administration. Of course, Cass Sunstein is a very well-known legal academic who has very public views about the value of cost-benefit analysis for regulatory decision-making. And if you were to look at the kind of the views and what was written by Cass Sunstein on this topic, and someone like John Graham, who was the OIRA administrator in the George W. Bush administration, there's some daylight between them, but they are also have a lot of overlap in their views. And so certainly about the use of cost-benefit analysis. And so when Sunstein was put in that role, again, it became clear the direction of the administration with respect to cost-benefit analysis. So the question was, in those early days, whether a synthesis could be forged between this progressive regulatory agenda and a commitment to cost-benefit analysis and the kind of the guardrails that that the administration had inherited. And over time, it became very clear that that it was going to be a successful synthesis. Of course, there's always going to be tensions in any administration between different factions, but the administration pursued a very substantial regulatory agenda. They adopted a number of extremely important regulations on many fronts. Some of those were ultimately knocked down by courts, as will always happen. But in general, the administration had a pretty robust record before courts of having its rules upheld. And then it turned out, even after the Trump administration sought to roll back a lot of these rules, the Trump administration had a difficulty doing so, in part because of the strength of the analysis that was undertaken by the Obama administration. So it wasn't clear that that was going to be a successful strategy, but ultimately it turned out to be a very successful strategy of pursuing this aggressive regulatory agenda, but doing so in a way that's within the longstanding bipartisan guardrails, and which include using robust and rigorous cost-benefit analysis. So the threatening synthesis, threatened kind of two groups simultaneously. So one were progressive opponents of cost-benefit analysis. So the folks who were still skeptical that cost-benefit analysis could or should be used to evaluate regulations in a neutral or unbiased way, consistent with a progressive regulatory agenda. Most of that group just kind of came over to the idea that actually, well, cost-benefit analysis, if it's consistent with strong environmental protections, and what they like is strong environmental protections, they're more or less happy to live with it. Not everybody, but that was kind of the general sense. On the other hand, the folks who viewed cost-benefit analysis instrumentally as a tool to roll back regulation and to dial back the degree of kind of intervention of the regulatory state were not happy, as one might imagine, with the Obama administration, because the administration was kind of showing that cost-benefit analysis was consistent with regulation and was adopting rules with really solid cost-benefit analyses behind them. And so there were a couple of different strategies that were used, and kind of came into prominence in the Republican opposition to the Obama administration, certainly after the Tea Party takeover in the midterm elections of 2010, and generally the opposition in Congress to the administration. And what we saw was a move away from a focus on things like costs and benefits and regulatory rationality, and a move towards rhetoric and rhetorical attacks that weren't focused on economic efficiency, but were focused on things like characterizing environmental protections as job-killing regulations. Right? So the term job-killing regulation really comes into its own in this period of time. Or the Obama administration's efforts to improve air quality were characterized as a war on coal, right? Or you started to see concerns being raised about like a nefarious deep state that was undermining, democratically accountable institutions. And so there was a shift away from cost-benefit analysis as this kind of agreed upon metric of regulatory success, and instead towards just very broad characterizations, rhetorical characterizations of the Obama administration's rulemakings, even when those rules were very sound from an economic perspective. So that kind of takes us up through the end of the Obama administration. And so the next part of the book kind of walks through what happens during the Trump administration. And, we have a couple of main points that I'll just mention first before getting into a couple of details. So one of the main points was to note that, a lot of the rhetoric, the anti-regulatory rhetoric, the kind of the moves that were made by the Trump administration and by Trump, the candidate, were reflecting broader trends that had already, kind of come about during the Obama administration in the Republican Party. So it was not that Trump was something new in that respect. His rhetoric was a little bit more coarse, it was a little bit more blatant, but it wasn't, entirely new. It didn't kind of come fully formed from his own head. He was really reflecting rhetoric and ideas that were in circulation and had been gaining prominence amongst, party operatives and politicians and interest groups in the prior several years. So that was, one of the points that we wanted to make in general. A second point, though, is to emphasize the degree to which the actual practices of the Trump administration with respect to regulatory review and with respect to cost-benefit analysis were just so extreme and out of line with the bipartisan consensus that had existed going back at least to Reagan and through the Obama administration. And, the idea here is that, of course, there was disagreement between the Obama administration and the George W. Bush administration about how to carry out cost-benefit analysis or how to prioritize, regulation or different regulatory approaches. No question about it. There was a lot of disagreement between those two administrations, and there was disagreement between the George W. Bush administration and the Clinton administration, and there was disagreements between the Clinton administration and the prior administration. But there was kind of a normal zone of disagreement about institutions and exactly the role that OIRA should play. Whether OIRA should be understood as reining in administrative agencies, or should it be understood as coordinating and empowering administrative agencies. So there was some disagreement about that. There were disagreements on certain methodological questions, about certain issues around emphasis. So the Obama administration undertook a pretty substantial effort to boost the degree to which agencies were taking behavioral economics into account. That's not super surprising given Cass Sunstein's interest in behavioral economics. Well within the mainstream of the economics literature, but certain moves are contestable, no doubt about it. Whether agencies are going to focus on improving their ability to monetize benefits, or they're going to focus on improving their ability to estimate employment effects from regulation. These are the legitimate disagreements and different emphases that we have seen, over the past several decades, kind of prior to the Trump administration. So that's kind of normal politics, and that is part of the idea of the guardrails, is to allow for some disagreement while cabining that disagreement within some reasonable boundaries. So in the kind of part 2 of the book, we spend a fair amount of time getting into the details of various moves made by the Trump administration to make the point that these moves were just very far away from anything that you had seen in any administration prior. They were really something new, something different, something very outside the prior bipartisan consensus. So I'll just give a couple of examples. So one is what's called the 2-for-1 order by the Trump administration. So just a little bit of context. So administrations of both political parties had agreed for many years, that it would be a good idea to expand what the practice of what's referred to as retrospective review. Okay, the idea being here that we adopt regulations all the time, really, but it's relatively rare for agencies to go back and review, whether a regulation was a good idea, whether it's achieving its goals, whether it could be improved, whether it should be eliminated altogether, whether it should be expanded, that kind of thing. And there's like broad agreement that this would be a good idea. And there's broad agreement that agencies don't really do a lot of this. In part, it actually sounds a lot easier than it is. The folks who do policy evaluation know that it is not so straightforward to actually estimate the causal effects of policy on the outcomes of interest. Nevertheless, we all agree that it would be nice to do that, and we probably could devote more resources to it. There was actually a major effort by the Obama administration under Cass Sunstein that they referred to as regulatory look back, the idea of which was to go through the existing stock of regulations and identify primarily candidates for elimination. This regulatory look back was mostly about reducing regulatory stringency, getting rid of old or outdated regulations. And again, that was an Obama administration initiative overseen by Cass Sunstein, the OIR administrator. Totally normal stuff. The Trump executive order was kind of pitched within that tradition of retrospective review, but it used kind of bizarre means that were divorced from the motivating theory of cost-benefit analysis and retrospective review in particular. So the structure of the review of the executive order, there was a couple of parts to it. So one was it required agencies to rescind 2 rules for every 1 rule that was adopted. Okay, so on its face, this is a very silly proposal because there's nothing special about this ratio. It's very easy for agencies to bundle or unbundle things. So what is 1 rule could be turned into 5 rules if an agency decides it wants to operate that way. So it's just very easy to game, and it's there's no requirement that the 2 rules be outdated or otherwise inefficient. So there's no requirement that the rescission of the 2 rules be itself cost benefit justified. Right? There's no prioritization of rules that impose net costs. There's nothing like that. The kind of stuff that you would expect in a rational exercise in retrospective review. So that's one component of the 2-for-1 executive order. And the second component was the institution of a regulatory budget. Now, regulatory budget itself is an idea that has a long pedigree. Back in the late 70s, early 80s, the idea of a regulatory budget was batted around as essentially an alternative to cost-benefit analysis. The idea with a regulatory budget is you tell an agency like EPA, when it imposes costs on private parties, that it's given a budget to do so. So this is a concern that the agency, has to account for its spending of tax dollars, but it doesn't have to account for spending when it imposes regulatory costs. And so the idea is, again, you impose a budget, you say EPA, you can impose $50 billion worth of costs on a given industry, go maximize the environmental benefits that you can achieve for that amount of costs. Ultimately, the regulatory budget has not been a particularly popular idea, in part because it's very hard to set the budget itself, and cost benefit analysis is kind of a superior tool because you ask for any given regulation how do you maximize net benefits. So the regulatory budget turns out just not to be as effective as an administrative tool as cost-benefit analysis. Anyway, the Trump administration resuscitates the idea of a regulatory budget and then imposes a regulatory budget of 0 in excess of current costs. Basically says agencies, in doing this 2-for-1 situation, cannot impose any additional net costs on industry, which again is a very strange thing to set that goal, because from a cost benefit perspective, it may be, the agency could identify an opportunity to save hundreds of thousands of lives, let's see, in the extreme case, for a few $1 million worth of costs, which would be extraordinarily well justified from a cost benefit perspective. But it can't do that unless it goes and finds other costs to reduce. And again, there's no requirement that in reducing those costs, that doesn't come along with, a reduction in benefits that are not justified. So it's this kind of arbitrary limit on agencies' ability to engage in regulatory decision-making that maximizes net benefits. So that was, that was another issue with the executive order. And that there's a final thing too, which is that you often a lot of benefits and costs, you can recharacterize a benefit as a negative cost and likewise. And so the structure of the order just invites a lot of gaming as well. So that was, in the early days of the Trump administration, a major regulatory initiative. It's an executive order signed by the President of the United States. It's a big deal when that kind of thing happens. And it just announced that the Trump administration was going to, move forward in a way, and it's going to proceed in a way that was very, very different from its predecessors from both political parties. So that was the 2-for-1 executive order. Very different in a way that it abandons the long tradition of rational use of cost-benefit analysis. So that's 2-for-1 executive order. A second initiative of the Trump administration that helps illustrate how far it had kind of moved from the established practice was its treatment of indirect benefits. So there's a pair of rulemakings that we talk about in the book that provides a really nice illustration of this. So an indirect cost or benefit is essentially just any cost or benefit from a rulemaking that occurs, that is not kind of the target of the regulation or the obvious costs that is associated with it, essentially the direct costs. So for example, you can have an air pollution regulation that's intended to reduce sulfur dioxide. That's the goal. It's operating under the statute that gives power to the agencies to reduce sulfur dioxide, and that's the goal of the regulation. In the course of that regulation, it may also reduce some other pollutants like greenhouse gas emissions. The reduction of those greenhouse gas emissions are an indirect benefit, just kind of by definition. On the other hand, on the cost side of the equation, industry may have to, let's say, use some technology that it will have to invest in. So that's a cost. It has to buy and operate this technology to reduce sulfur dioxide emissions. And let's just imagine that that technology also generates a waste product that has to be disposed of, that has some negative environmental consequences. Well, the direct cost would be the cost of the technology. And then the environmental consequences of the waste product generated by the technology would be an indirect cost, okay? So again, going back to the early days of cost-benefit analysis, agencies have taken into account direct and indirect costs and benefits. That's just been the standard practice. John Graham actually wrote a book about the importance of taking into account what he referred to as countervailing risks, because sometimes it can be a little complicated to think about what the actual indirect costs or benefits are going to be. You have to understand in equilibrium how consumers might substitute away from one product to another product. You have to figure out what that product's going to be. Same, kind of ditto on the benefit side. You affect ecosystems, that can have lots of different consequences that spill out into the economy or into the environment. And so as a conceptual matter, it's straightforward. As a practical matter, it can be difficult and complicated to chase these down, even important ones. And John Graham, one of his more important works, Risk versus Risk, a book that he wrote, a couple of decades ago, highlights the importance and the need for agencies to attend to these indirect. Now, he focused on indirect costs, but he always recognized that indirect benefits were important as well. It was potentially important. The A4 circular, which is a guidance document adopted by OIRA to tell agencies how to conduct cost-benefit analysis. That guidance document directs agencies to account for both indirect costs and indirect benefits. Administrations of both political parties have done so in their regulations and regulatory impact assessments. So what does the Trump administration do? So in the Obama administration, one of the most important rulemakings of the Obama administration was an effort to reduce mercury pollution from the electricity generating sector. So coal-fired power plants burn coal, puts mercury into the atmosphere. And there's a provision in the Clean Air Act that directs the agency to reduce that pollution. The Obama administration adopts a strong rule, and that rule has benefits, has the direct mercury benefits, and it also has very substantial indirect benefits that come from particulate matter pollution. So the agency counts those, sums them up, looks at the costs, and finds that the costs exceed the benefits by several factors. Okay, $90 billion benefits, $10 billion worth of costs, that kind of scale. So the administration adopts the rule, actually gets litigated on a different point, sent back to the agency. There was a little bit of back and forth, but ultimately this rule kind of persisted over this whole period of time, and power plants complied with the rule, and it saved a lot of lives. The Trump administration, when it moved in, put the Mercury Rule on the chopping block as one of the things that it was looking to undermine. And so in one of its early efforts, one of the kind of early rulemakings, one of the things the agency had to do was make an appropriate and necessary determination under the Clean Air Act to move forward with the regulation. And the Trump administration said that the agency had used an inappropriate cost-benefit analysis when making the appropriate and necessary determination, and in particular, reversed its decision to rely on the indirect benefits associated with the rulemaking and its regulatory impact assessment. And again, that decision directly contradicts the A4 circular and the practice at EPA for basically every regulatory context that you can imagine going back decades for, again, administrations of both political parties. So that's the Mercury rulemaking. All right. Now, the real kicker here is what happens in another rulemaking during the Trump administration. Okay, just to get this gets us into the weeds a little bit, but it really helps to clarify the matter. So in that case, the Trump administration was looking to dial back air pollution regulations dealing with automobiles. Okay, and so this was a rule to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from cars under the Obama administration. Trump administration wants to roll it back. Part of the argument that the Trump administration offered in its regulatory impact assessment was that by dialing back these pollution control requirements, which was going to allow the dial back of the pollution control requirements was going to let cars have worse fuel economy and therefore be bigger. Okay, so the cars would be bigger under the Trump administration proposal. That they argued that would lead to fewer automobile deaths. Okay, now putting aside the whether that claim is true or not, that there would actually be fewer automobile deaths, it's probably wrong for various reasons. But given even just stipulating that in its regulatory impact assessment of this rule, it includes the reduction in automobile benefits. Reduction in automobile deaths as a benefit of the rulemaking. That is clearly an indirect benefit. It's actually even more indirect than in the Mercury rulemaking, the particulate matter benefits. But in this case, the Trump administration includes it in its regulatory impact assessment. So when indirect benefits will promote deregulation, the Trump administration is happy to use them. And when indirect benefits promote regulation, they say that it's illegitimate and the agency shouldn't be using them. And so, this is the kind of stuff that happened during the Trump administration, just shows a ridiculous level of inconsistency, which is a clear indication that there's not any intellectual commitments at play here towards the methodology. The methodology is just being used as a post hoc rationalization for decisions that are made on ideological or political grounds. Okay, I'm actually going to skip the final point that I was going to make about trivializing climate change benefits because we're a little low on time. And so I want to leave some time for Q&A. But that was another area where the Trump administration kind of played fast and loose with received cost-benefit analysis methodology. So when we wrote the book, we submitted it to the publisher in the summer of 2020. It was the early days of the pandemic. Already, if we all recall that time, it had become clear that the Trump administration, in its general tendency to ignore experts and analysis, was not moving aggressively enough to deal with that situation. And but we didn't know what was going to happen with the election, of course, and so we kind of made a set of recommendations and thoughts for the future that was really intended to structure the conversation within both political parties. And part of what we argue there is, in Retaking Rationality, we had noted that there was this longstanding bipartisan consensus, and progressives ought to kind of acknowledge that reality and engage in debates over how to conduct cost-benefit analysis rather than just fighting its existence. What we acknowledge at the end of Reviving Rationality is that the Trump administration had severely destabilized that consensus, that you had agreement between both political parties that they were essentially going to use this technique to legitimate their rulemakings, to rationalize their decision making. The Trump administration just departed from that agreement, and there's a question for both political parties going forward of what they were going to do. With the Republican Party, the question was going to be: Are we going to keep with the trajectory of the Trump administration? Are we moving away from cost-benefit analysis? Are we moving away from that style of governance? Or are we going to change course? Right? Are we going to recognize in many respects the Trump administration was not successful? Its regulatory agenda was extremely unsuccessful. Actually, wasn't able to do nearly as many. It didn't accomplish a lot of deregulation. It didn't do very much one way or the other. It didn't do a lot of regulation, but it didn't accomplish a lot of deregulation. It had a terrible time in courts. And so it's a possible lesson to be learned for the Republican Party is that this tact of moving away from cost-benefit analysis and regulatory rationality was not a success, and that it instead made sense to change course. And for the Democratic Party, the question is, if the Republicans are not going to use cost-benefit analysis, maybe we shouldn't either. Maybe this is a constraint that we're imposing on ourselves. Certainly, there are going to be constituencies within the Democratic Party who say, "Look, we don't need to do this anymore." It was one thing when the Republicans were doing it and we were kind of forced into it, but we don't need to impose this constraint on ourselves if the Republicans aren't going to do it. And so that's kind of the choice that I think still faces both political parties going forward, and is likely to be a conversation that we'll have for some time. We argue that it would be good to continue to use cost-benefit analysis. We think this is a good institution. Of course, it can be improved. And so what we argue for the future in the book is that subsequent administrations should make clear that they're committed to cost-benefit analysis, should rebuild the institutions associated with cost-benefit analysis, including OIRA review. The Biden administration, in its first or second day, issued a presidential memorandum stating that it was keeping in place cost-benefit analysis and recommitting itself to rigorous use of cost-benefit analysis. And then we also argue in the book that any institution needs to be dynamic and change and grow and learn. And so we point to several different dimensions along which cost-benefit analysis can be improved and the methodology can be deepened in terms of things like quantifying benefits and costs that are hard to quantify, in terms of figuring out how to appropriately account for the distributional impacts of regulatory decision-making and incorporating that into cost-benefit analysis as it's done by agencies. So these are the kind of methodological improvements that we think will continue to allow cost-benefit analysis to remain a vital and important institution in regulatory decision-making. But ultimately, that future depends entirely or nearly entirely on the choices of political decision makers in both political parties. The Biden administration, we can maybe talk about in Q&A, has been an important course corrective, but that doesn't mean that we're not going to just revert back to one way or the other, depending on future political developments. So that's it for my presentation. I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you, Michael. That was great. Just such a good return to the discussion of this important framework and really this important topic that has been central to the study for the Center of American Business and now the Wheatbaum Center over really 50 years. So thank you very much for this. We have a few good questions in the chat. There go some different directions. I have some things I want to add in here too. So let me go to some of the more specific questions first, and then maybe talk a little bit about the broader context. So we have this question about the legal implications of the Trump strategy. In particular, Dan Smith asks how the Trump administration, playing, as he calls it, fast and loose with its own cost-benefit analysis rules, impacted the judicial review. And you suggested, I think, in your talk that there was the Trump administration had a pretty hard time in the courts. So maybe you could comment a little bit more on this.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Trump administration had an abysmal record before the courts on regulatory decision making. The Institute for Policy Integrity, which is a think tank at NYU that Richard Revesz directs and that I helped start up, years ago, 15 years ago. At this point, they had a tracker where they took a look at every administrative law decision that reviewed a Trump administration rulemaking or regulatory decision of some kind. And the loss rate for the Trump administration was staggering. I think all told, it stands at something around 80%, 80% losses, which is really horrendous. It's really just striking. Generally speaking, agencies get deference from courts. Agencies generally win. Like if in the past, if you had to guess, not knowing anything else, whether an agency or the challenger won, you would always say the agency. Prior administrations had win rates closer to 70%, so a loss rate of 30%. So you're literally talking about doubling or nearly tripling the loss rate of prior administrations. And so now, why was the loss rate so huge? There were a few different reasons for that. Part of it was definitely shoddy analysis, no question about it. There were rules that were specifically struck down for their shoddy analysis. And then there was also kind of a broader related set of kind of norm violations. So delaying rules without justification, right? Just issuing like a blanket delay without going through the proper procedure, like having opportunities for public comment. Issuing enforcement decisions that didn't make any sense. Not going through and doing the proper analysis under the National Environmental Policy Act, where you do like an environmental impact statement. So there was kind of a suite of regulatory procedures. Really, these are just the guardrails that we're talking about. There's a variety of these different guardrails, of which cost-benefit analysis is one. And the Trump administration's tendencies to violate the guardrails weren't limited to just cost-benefit analysis. It was all this stuff. And as a consequence, they had a terrible time in court.
Thanks for that. Actually, before we go to the next question, I did want to mention and thank our co-sponsors. I should have done this at the beginning, but now there are actually more people on. So I do want to thank the Washington University School of Law Public Interest and Policy Speaker Series as the co-sponsor, and also the Department of Economics. So I'd like to get into this issue, and I think a number of the questions go in this direction. So you've talked about the guardrails, but see me on the screen here, the distance between the guardrails also is pretty large. Mm-hmm. That is, you could have basic agreement on cost-benefit analysis, but ultimately very different approaches. You mentioned how the progressives in some ways want to get outside the guardrails. The Trump administration wants to get outside the guardrails, but within cost-benefit analysis, there's a lot of challenges in estimating costs and benefits. Professor Lee Benham, my colleague, mentions a kind of nutty thing that we have here in St. Louis, which is a trolley, which is just a few blocks north of our campus, that passed a cost-benefit test and had really big costs and doesn't seem to have any benefits ex post. I've heard criticisms of OIRA in particular is saying it's kind of a joke. It doesn't really estimate the cost correctly. On the benefit side, there's so much subjectivity. How do we talk about what the benefit would be of preserving the North Slope of Alaska for the reindeer? How do we deal with uncertainty about whether, if we allow too much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, the Greenland ice cap comes off? The kinds of issues that are related to these regulations are open to lots of interpretation and lots of judgment calls in terms of what happens. So, as a defender of cost-benefit analysis, and I must say I share your view, but I'm thinking the critics from both sides can say almost like maybe this is hopeless to estimate these things. How might you respond to that?
Right. Well, some of these are fair. Don't lose hope. I think I would say would be my quick response. So there's a couple of things. So one that I think is clear now is if cost benefit analysis were like so open textured and so indeterminate, then there wouldn't be broad agreement that what the Trump administration did was terrible, right? But there is. The Trump administration proved that cost benefit analysis is not so open textured that you can just do whatever the heck you want, right? There actually are norms, right? That there are methods that have been passed down. There are more and less appropriate ways to do things, okay? So I think the Trump administration is just a case in point, just actually many cases in point of how there are constraints in the methodology of cost benefit analysis. Okay, so that's kind of one general point. So the idea that it's just like so open that anything is potentially justified is just, the lie to that is given by the examples of the Trump administration. Now, on other issues like, say, climate change uncertainty. So uncertainty, actually, we can deal with like within cost benefit analysis. There's a whole literature about how to deal with uncertainty, risk aversion, catastrophic losses, those kinds of things. And there might be disagreement on like values. So that's another, I think, important point to make about cost benefit analysis. There are some folks who would like to present cost benefit analysis and normative economics, generally welfare economics, as an entirely empirical exercise that is kind of divorced from values. I think that's a mistake. I mean, I know that it's wrong, and I think it's a mistake to try to engage in that particular move. The types of economics that we're talking about, welfare economics, normative economics, cost benefit analysis, there are values choices embedded in there. Some of those values choices are very plausible. Things like, if we can make everyone better off, we should. But that's a values choice. That's a moral claim. And there are more controversial moral claims that are built into cost benefit analysis. For example, like how we should treat future generations, right? Should we treat future generations as equally important, or should we not? And there's different ways of thinking about that. And that comes up in the context of, like, of the discount rate. I'll just note, use of a positive discount rate does not mean that you're undervaluing future generations, but there's different discount rates that you could use and different justifications for different discount rates that are going to implicate questions about intergenerational responsibility, intergenerational distribution. So absolutely, there are questions of value that come up in cost benefit analysis, and there are very difficult scientific questions that are often implicated by cost benefit analyses, like predicting the consequences of climate change, for that matter, right? If you put out a ton of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, we don't ultimately know what the consequences of that are going to be. We know that climate change is real and that humans cause climate change, but the scope of the harm and the relationship between atmospheric concentrations and temperature and on the ground consequences, that's all, subject to scientific disagreement. And even things like the relationship between toxic exposures and cancer is, often unclear. And so we have to make judgment calls about those empirical matters. And there are going to be reasonable disagreements about those empirical matters. But that's fine. That's normal politics. That's normal policy making. If we're uncomfortable with that, you got to move to the woods, or you live under a dictatorship or something. Like, we have to grapple with some of this uncertainty and values disagreement and empirical uncertainty. That's just a reality. Cost benefit analysis provides us with a framework for doing that. I think it's a pretty good one. And then ultimately, what's the alternative? Raw politics, or kind of absolutist moral approaches, liberty is the most important value, or health is the most important value, and no way for us to negotiate over those things and deliberate over how to make trade-offs.
Thank you. Our former director, Steve Smith, just typed a question into the chat, which I think is pretty interesting. So this is a response to your analysis of what's happened in the Trump administration, but the question is straightforward. Should Congress enact legislation to reduce the White House manipulation of regulatory review, and what would that look like? Do you think it could be useful as a law professor? This probably seems like kind of thing that might be right in your expertise.
Yeah, so this is something I give a thought to. It's in a proposal that's been on the table over the years. I think it's always worth considering. My own view is that I'm not very enthusiastic about turning, of making cost benefit analysis a statutory exercise. And part of this is about the institutional differences between courts and OIRA in particular. And there are lots of differences between OIRA and the courts, right? Courts, some of it we like, and some of it are very problematic from a regulatory perspective. So, courts are independent, that's good. can be good anyway, right? Courts are not experts in economic analysis, right? So if we are going to require courts to be doing really probing review, I think that's going to challenge courts' expertise. There's actually a much bigger problem though. So rulemaking is a very long, painstaking, and expensive process. Usually takes at least a couple of years. It can take 10 years to do a rulemaking. It's very, very difficult and time consuming and resource intensive. One of the things that agencies do in the course of these rulemakings is they know they have to get through OIRA. And so they can work with OIRA during that process. So they can send OIRA an idea, like, is this an appropriate approach to valuing this, this benefit? Or, we heard from industry that there's this suite of costs. We're skeptical. What do you think? Right? And kind of have a little bit of discourse with OIRA in the course of developing the regulation, so that when the rules you put the final, dotted the I's and crossed the T's, you send it to OIRA, you can be confident that it's going to overcome review. With courts, it doesn't work like that at all. You have to operate in the blind for like however long, multiple years, and you're going to send it to the courts, assuming you're in the DC circuit, which it would be, that's convenient. That's where many rules are reviewed. But even then, there's all the judges of the DC circuit. There's going to be a random panel drawn, so you don't even know who's going to be reviewing the thing. Somehow you have to make this rule robust to all these different iterations of different judges who will be reviewing it with different levels of expertise. And if you lose, it's like back to the drawing board. You pretty much, that means you're going to shelve the regulation. That's what typically happens, or at the very least, it's many years worth of additional effort to get another crack. So that big institutional difference between courts and OIRA, I think, makes it difficult for courts to really be the actor that's enforcing the norms. Already, courts do some enforcement around cost-benefit norms under the arbitrary and capricious review standard. I think they do a reasonable job under existing law. So in any case, those are just some quick thoughts on the potential of legislation in this area.
Well, thanks very much. This has just been really illuminating. I've learned a lot about cost-benefit analysis. I wish our late colleague Murray Wiedenbaum was here to have a conversation with you. We'd probably say maybe we have a little bit too much regulation still, but let's certainly stay within the guardrails of cost-benefit analysis, recognizing that those guardrails are really pretty wide, and there's a lot of room for judgment and kind of hashing out through the democratic process in this way of approaching policymaking. So thanks very much for this, Michael. Thanks to everybody on the Wiedenbaum Center, everybody joining us today. We had a good crowd here for an 8 o'clock in the morning discussion here in St. Louis. I do want to just do a quick plug for another event that's coming up on March 8th. We will be happy to welcome Professor Olivier Blanchard from MIT and the International Monetary Fund and many places. Olivier is one of the most prominent economists of his generation, and he's got a lot of interesting work on government debt and fiscal policy in the current environment and how things have changed with low interest rates. So I think it's going to be a fascinating talk. It's going to be co-sponsored by the entire Elliott Society at Washington University. So really exciting event coming up on the afternoon of March 8th. So it's right at 9 o'clock. I'll stop it here. Thank our speaker, Michael Livermore, again. Thanks to everybody for your support of the Wiedenbaum Center. We can't do this without you, and we will see you again soon. So I'll end here and look forward to seeing people in the coming weeks. Thanks again, Michael.
Thanks very much.